sorry. So let's go back and see and talk about Greek civilization in brief, Western thoughts and in Western thought and culture. As I said, these are the topics that we'll define. We'll take the definition of civilization, geographical background, talk about Sparta and Athens, religion and sport, art and architectural style, writing, literature and drama, Greek thinkers, Alexander the Great, one of the main and major personalities to be dealt with and understood here. An overview of Greek and civilization. We'll try to have a video concerning this. And this is a painting that reflects the Greek civilization. Very, very unique nature in sculpture, in buildings, in art, in literature, in drama, in everything. Now, civilization, as I said, it comes from the Latin word civis. That means someone who lives in a town, and people who are civilized. This is why we say people are civilized. It refers to civis, that is a Latin word, referring to them as living in towns. And at that time, living in town, it's like living in a city nowadays, because they have two types of people who are isolated and family who are isolated in groups, and they are not in small they are in small tribes and not well organized, and other people who are organized, well organized, and they live in towns, and they call them civis. Okay, so this is how the word civilization came. And it is more, it's like an advanced stage of organization. That means law, that has laws, culture, and regular way of food, and protecting based on culture, of course, and protecting people by law. Now, the Greek civilization in the beginning, it was based on, their living was based on agriculture, and it is a system of government, like what we have nowadays, monarchs or monarchies. And the word and democracy was known at that time. We'll talk about that later on. In terms of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, for example. They speak of elections and common, even the languages that were used, the language that was used at that time, that is reflected in their way of thinking, and the religion that is philosophic and rather than the way that we think of religion nowadays. Okay, they teach people how to think, how the young people, the young generation, how to think, how to use knowledge. And civilizations, it was since the Sumerians, for example, and the Egyptian people, they have their writings. And also the Greek people, they have their writings, their sculptures, their artistic things, everything, and they have more or less the buildings, for example. Everything is clear in their at that time, that reflects their culture. And we can think also of civilization as an advanced state of or intellectual culture, that you can combine it with the material development. And this is what makes it different from culture, that it is material more than not only intellectual and cultural. So it is materialistic development in human society, that you can see through that the progress of and realization of art and science, and even their moral conduct, because as I mentioned before, moral conduct is part of philosophy, which the moral issues, it's part of philosophy, which is called ethics. It is discussed based on philosophical issues, the idea of right and wrong, truth and false, and so on, and even logic comes there. And also they used their, everything was recorded in their writings to illustrate their ideas. Now, If you want to take an idea about the geographical background, the Greek peninsula is situated in the south of Europe. It's on the Mediterranean Sea, and the mainland of Greece is surrounded by a number of islands. Now, the climate of Greece is very good. It's like ours here. It's excellent, and it's usually because of the, the Mediterranean Sea that is surrounded there. It's healthy and moderate. Okay, so it's Mediterranean in a way. It's like ours. This is a map. You can see this is a map since 2005, you see, but it illustrates the same geographic parts. We have here Athens and Sparta, okay, and this is the Olympia that we have the Olympiads that is referring to them when we talk games and sports, okay. It was all raised from here, the idea, and this is the ancient Greece, okay, but the main two, very famous cities is Athens and Sparta. Athens is known for its philosophy and philosophers. Sparta is more for soldiers and the military part that used to defend the place. Okay. Now this is Sparta. It was isolated state. They used to call it city states. Okay, city state, yani state that is in that city. Okay, so the Sparta is an isolated city state. Sorry, that was culturally and politically different from Athens. Okay, so if you look at Sparta, if you want to compare it to Athens, you will see it as if you have two completely different city-states, okay? One that they differ in different things. They differ in culture, they differ in its political order or authorities, okay? Now, we'll explain how. Sparta was an oligarchy. Now, if you wanted to check oligarchy, okay, do you know what's meant by oligarchy? This is a very important word because it's one type of governments. You see, this is the oligarchy government. It's in Greek, okay, which part of which it means the rule or command. Okay, so it's ruling or commanding. Okay, it's a form of power structure in which power vests with a small number of people. So only a small number of people is governing, is ruling, okay? So, and usually they are the noble people. So it's distinct nobility, people wealthy enough and highly educated. Usually philosophers or people well educated at that time, and sometimes religious, because this term is also used nowadays, oligarchy. In Arabic also they say it oligarchy. Okay, it goes back to this word, and also it is reflected in military control. Okay, this is the root of it. So now Sparta was known as an oligarchic, government, and government ruled by few people. So it's the opposite of democracy, if you want. They had two kings, and there was no scope for one becoming a tyrant or dictator. You had the dictatorship, as opposed to democracy, was there in Sparta. Okay, of course, the dictator is a tyrant person who rules according to the oligarchy government. Okay. Now, Spartan society was obsessed with war. They all their you can I think that you have seen many films on that. Troy, maybe you've seen a film called Troy. It's all based on this. That we have they all their lives is full of war and wars. Okay, and soldiers. So it is military life in Sparta. Boys were sent to military school. So schools were known as military only. at that time and in that era, and they were there in a young age, very early age. Boys, even they were so tough and rude that boys who are born deformed are left to die, okay, on mountainsides. They think that they are not good enough to continue, so because they will not be able to join soldiers in military schools and military life, so they refuse to accept them. And this is very brutal, of course. uh, Also, here are some pictures that illustrate that. In Sparta, you see Sparta, War of Empires. I'm sure that you've seen such films like this. A very famous film that's called Troy. I'll let you see here. Maybe I can let you see that. You'll see it later on. But for example, if you write the word Troy, Tarwada, okay, in Arabic, very well known story, San Tarwada, okay. This is Troy. This is it, okay. Very famous. The Hector versus Achilles. Here we have one of the famous artists. This is the full movie of Troy. You can see it later on, okay. Now, going back to the story now, Athens, on the other hand, it's quite the opposite. Okay, in Athens, you see it as this is the capital and this is the largest city of Greece. Okay, which is nowadays, and Athenian people or Athenians, they developed Greek literature. So the literature that you are seeing nowadays, the art, architecture, philosophy, politics, law, everything that you can see now, that is cultural, that reflect the good side of Greece, goes back to Athens, not to Sparta. Okay. Now the Athenians, they took some steps with that. They work on the establishment of democratic system of the government, and from here comes the meaning or the roots of democracy that rules nowadays. And of course, it's so different from what we have as democracy in Athens at that time is not the same democracy that we have here nowadays, for example, in America or in Arab world. So different types of democracies we have, but they initiated the democratic system, and we'll talk about it later on. Of course, you can see here also, this is very famous. Even we have some sculptures of that in our countries, and because of their colonization, of course. You can see the sculpture here, how very artistic. Now, in terms of religion and sport, as I told you, the Olympic Games, the ancient Greeks worshipped many gods, as we said, and goddesses. And as we mentioned, we write it with a small g, because we have many gods and goddesses. And they celebrate, and this is very important. They give a very important look at the goddesses, not only gods. So they believe in feminine part of that, and they celebrated the religious festivals concerning that. One of the very famous festivals is called the Panathenaic festival. And you can see also different games that honor God, one of the famous gods, God, which is Zeus, in Olympia. And upon that, we call them the Olympic Games. That, of course, nowadays we don't consider them religious, as a religious festival, but it is important because it goes back to that history or culture. So it's now an international sport or a sport event, right? Now this is how they used to fight. That was in Sparta and reflected in Olympia. As one of the, as I gave you here, one of the famous places, Olympia. So see how Sparta is nearer to Olympia. So the sport, let's say the military part was illustrated in Olympia if they are having festivals, okay? Not real wars at that time. Now, even in painting, you can see this. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, this is one of the University of Pennsylvania in Pennsylvania University museum that reflects Sparta and Olympia. Okay, Greek literature. Now, if you wanted to talk about art and architectural style, you can see the ancient Greeks who loved, all kind of art. They are known for the marble and bronze, and in their sculpture they try to reflect everything real. So we call it realistic art. Okay, الواقعي, الفن الواقعي, realistic art. And they have, because we have nowadays something is called surrealist. We'll talk about it later. Seriali, الفن السريالي. So it's at that time it was realistic, and they built, of course, the realistic to reflect what was happening, wars and the order of even philosophers and how democracy was raised at that time. They built temples, of course. They have large stones and pillars, as you can see here in such buildings here, large stones and pillars. Their architectural design, it's very, very known and famous, and still have an influence here in modern architects nowadays, right? And even in our countries, in Arab and Mediterranean and Middle East. And this is very famous. We'll see. We'll take a look at that. Now, in writings, now as you can see here are the gods and goddesses that they're treated by philosophers as the pillars, see, of their temples, let's say. Okay. Now the writing, the ancient Greek invented alphabets, and the alphabets were 24. And these are the letters, okay, and the units and symbols from that culture were written in even used in other languages, and are still used in science and in mathematics nowadays. And I'm sure you've seen that. I'll see if you can see here. For example, if you want to write Greek alphabet, okay, let's see Greek alphabet in literature, for example, here, so as to take an idea what is meant. I'm sure you know the Greek alphabets and Roman alphabets. Here are the Greek alphabets. Can you see that? Okay, so interpreted later on, you can see it in mathematics. Some of them, see here, you can see some of them in mathematics. I'm sure that those who studied in the scientific stream know that. Okay, so we have a very, very, let's say, a Greek alphabetic system and symbols that are reflected in their writings, and also copied, that they were copied by the Romans and used in their language too. So the Latin language later, they developed the same letters or same alphabets, and used in a kind of interpretation of that in modern European languages that were derived later on. Okay, so we're talking here about linguistics and the origin of languages. Now, if you want to talk, I'm just giving you a little glimpse, okay, not everything, just in brief as an introduction. Now, the literature and drama, I'm sure that you may have taken a glimpse of that the works of ancient Greek literature are still, popular till now, and we call them the classics, okay? So our classical work or classics in literature are very famous. The main or most famous, they include, for example, the Iliad Iliad and Odyssey, you know, Iliada, Odessa. In Arabic, they say it also. They composed by Homer. And we have different fables like Aesop fable and Herodotus fable. They are reflected in history. And we have also different, let's say, ancient Greece histories and historians that were reflected that in literature. You can see in any script till now, the main or greatest poet in ancient Greece was called Homer. And you know, he's compared to our era in the Arabic era. When we talk about, you know, in Arabic we say mu'allaqat. So it's epic. It's like it was it has a kind of let's say the beginning was in Homer, with Homer, who was blind, but he wrote masterpieces. Can you imagine that he was blind, but he wrote masterpieces of literature. Like in Arabic, we have, for example, Taha Hussein, right? We'll talk about it in comparison later. And he was the famous Greek poet. His Greek poem that was very famous, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And they keep talking about them. Maybe it's a good idea if one of you next time talk about one of these, okay? And Homer. I'll leave this to you, those who want to talk about it. Now, here is the Iliad of Homer, and it was translated, of course, in English. Here are the alphabets in Greek, till it was translated, as you can see, by, who is it? Can you read it? Translated by Stanley Lombardo, okay, and introduced by Shelley Marnigan, okay. Now, we have different interpretations, of course, but that was the main one, okay. Now, let's talk about Greek thinkers, and this is what's most important to me, because we are talking about philosophy and we wanted to go back to philosophy here. Now, famous philosophers in ancient Greece, the main famous three names are Socrates, okay, here we have Socrates, Socrates, Plato, Aflaton, and Aristotle, Aristo, okay. They laid the famous, you know, foundations of Western philosophy nowadays. So, and even not only the Western, let me tell you something, even the Eastern. The Islamic, maybe this is something that you may not know, even the Islamic philosophy, most part of it is given or is related to the Greek philosophy, because they translated things into their languages. The Arab philosophers and Islamist philosophers, they used to, you know, translation was very famous at that time. And they tried just to make kind of customization according to our religion, okay. But the roots are in the stories. If you listen to the stories and the roots, you will see a very unique comparison that is very similar to it, okay. So only those who know the Greek philosophies and literature can understand that and realize that. Now, Socrates encouraged people to, you know, to pursue knowledge, to think deeply, to raise questions, not to accept anything without questioning. So he was kind of what we call skeptic. So the idea of skepticism, مبدأ الشك, okay, was at that time. Plato started a school at that time, مدرسة الأرسطية and مدرسة أفلاطون. We have two different schools, and at that time he wrote a book. Plato wrote a very famous book that talks about the organization, and of course from different sides. They're talking about politics, talking about education, about social communities, about law and order, about conduct and ethics and everything. So he organized the sayings even of Socrates. Socrates, who was, of course, now it's like his teacher. Okay, so you can think about Aristotle as the student of Plato, and Plato as the student of Socrates. Okay, so this was number one, and then came Plato, and then came Aristotle. Of course, they were at the same time, but I mean, in terms of who was the teacher, if we want to say, or the mentor, okay, and who was the student and who was the scholar, okay. Now, Plato started, as I said, a school and wrote a book to organize the sayings of Socrates. So all what we can see about Socrates was written by Plato. Plato reflecting the thoughts and sayings of his um, tutor or teacher, Socrates. So he was a very a great, student who was very faithful to his teacher, in a way, if you want to say this. Now, Aristotle taught also people to study the facts about truth, what is truth, what is false, and this argument that went at that time. And he was the first person to classify what is meant by knowledge nowadays. So the word knowledge came in roots of thinking by the philosopher Aristotle. Okay, so we have what we call the logician logic, the Aristotelian logic, okay, or منطق الأرسطي they call it, okay, very famous way of thinking. Now, this is the photo of Socrates, if you want to have a look at that. Socrates, who was a philosopher, he was the teacher of Plato, as I told you, and he emphasized ethics. So the main things that he emphasized was ethics, which is the study of morals and moral issues, and code of ethics. And he encouraged people to, as I told you, to pursue or knowledge, that they should not accept things like myths without knowing the reality and truth. But of course, truth differs in meaning according to one from another. Now, Plato, this is Plato, photo or picture, or here it's a painting for Plato. He was a philosopher who opened a school in Athens, and he taught students to think, independently. Independently means without any thing affecting you, that compels you in a certain way, that makes you constrained. Okay, so for example, this is the beginning of accepting science, in a way, let's say, and scientific method through discussion. And then came Aristotle, who was highly regarded as a philosopher and a father of logic and reasoning. And when you say reason, we talk about mind here. So he was the first person to define and classify knowledge into branches, as I told you. And then we know, we'll talk maybe next lecture after your assignment, about Alexander the Great, who was, a ruler, a great ruler, who's known as an emperor, also Al-Iskandar al-Kabir, okay, in Arabic. And he set up a large empire that conquered Persia, Bilad al-Furs nowadays, and Egypt also, and Alexandria, Iskandariya was known after this name, Alexander the Great. He conquered it, and North India also. At between see the time, at that time, 334 till 323 BC, before Christ. So he was not from Athens, but Macedonia, from the place that was near it. And Alexander was a brilliant military strategist, and we say strategist referring to strategies. He made strategies, military strategies for war. And his favorite book was Homer, Iliad, as the one I told you about now. And Alexander conquered, as I told you, the Persian Empire, and he controlled everything. It was the largest empire in the world at that time. So they were force or power number one in the world. Okay, and of course, the world. They say that no empire was seen as largest as that empire at that time of Alexander, who spread what we call the Hellenistic. Okay, even in Arabic they call Hellenistia. Okay, Hellenistic culture. They call it Hellenistic culture that was reflected in Asia later on. Now, as you can see also, where is it? You can see also here the photos of the Alexander the Great, and this is like an overview of Greek civilization. You can also go back to what we call the Plutarch and Greek lives, and this is one of the main books, and that you can go back and have a look at it. It's in Oxford University. You can have this and search to get more information here. Okay. Now, by this, I gave you maybe an idea about the Greek literature and culture at that time, with very brief idea. I'll make stop recording here. I'll listen to your questions.